This is the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad Network.
Welcome back to Such Sights to Show, a All Things Clive Barker podcast. I'm Joe Lipsett, and I'm joined as always by Mr. Brian Christopher. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Joe. And I think this is a first where we're not alone.
It's true, yes. We have used the opportunity to bring in a Horror Queers crossover, so I'm delighted to welcome also Trace. Hi, Trace.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me, both of you, thank you for letting me come and crash your party.
I feel like this is like a retcon from all the complaining that I did about not being able to be on your Bloodline Horror Queers episode, so this is kind of... This is kind of just bringing it back to that.
Yeah.
I have caught so much shit from Brian over the years of like, you invited me on other ones, but not the Bloodline episode.
Well, because we've had you on 1, 3, and soon to be 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I couldn't remember if we actually had you on 1 or not, but wait, no. Wait, did we cover 4 first, Joe?
We did.
Oh my God.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, by the time you're done, the order is going to have been 4, 3, 1, and 2.
Correct.
And which is such a shame because 2 is my favorite one. So the fact that we had to wait 4 years to do that is real bullshittery.
Well,
We're
it's
just
it's the finale.
It. It's like pretty much nearly all of ours. It's either 1 or 2 is your favorite.
Right. Yeah, so we started with the controversial one, then the silly one, and then moved into the good ones.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we also have been waiting for anniversaries, so.
That's true. But, I mean, there's a special occasion for this one, though, right?
Yes. Yeah. We are talking about the Hellraiser Bloodline Workprint. So we've talked about 4. So, Brian, you and I have talked about it. Trace, you and I have talked about it.
Right.
And then Brian and I have a separate episode dedicated to Peter Atkins's original screenplay that presumably attracted Kevin Yeager. And now we're getting this Workprint, which is part of the Arrow Quadrilogy 4K set. Folks, we've talked about it before. Gorgeous package. Mm-hmm. But this is basically the raison d'etre to buy this set because no one has ever seen this before. And Brian, I'm going to kick it to you first because you and I have speculated so long about what this Workprint was going to involve. And it was not what we ended up getting, I'm surprised to say.
I think the best thing I can do is to manage expectations in the same way that Arrow managed expectations. And I'm going to read the little precursor that they give. Yes. Because I think this is all about managing expectations. Okay. Because you sent me a screenshot of this. And yeah, it's very noticeable what they're trying to do here. Mm-hmm. The following version of Hellraiser Bloodline is a workprint with temporary music and sound effects. It was assembled sometime after Kevin Yeager's departure from the film. Even though his name is still listed as director in the opening credits, it is most emphatically not his director's cut, which remains lost. This version, which has a different plot structure and some alternate material compared to the final quote-unquote Alan Smithy cut, is presented from a time-coded VHS, the best material available for this release. So basically, this is them saying, like, for those hoping for the Yeager cut, this is not that. This was the closest we could get.
Yeah. Which, honestly, I mean, like, the biggest change for me, though, I was like, oh, we're just telling it chronologically. Like, there are a couple of new scenes, extended scenes, alternate scenes, but the biggest change for me is that chronological narrative.
Right, which, of course, is the way that the film was originally meant to be presented before it was hacked to bits and we get this Alan Smithy cut. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see it as it was intended to originally play out, although even here, it's still not the way that Atkins originally envisioned it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like here, even though they don't do the framing where it starts in space and then comes back, it's still, like, it's somehow even less structured so that you get like more of the past. Like at least in the Alan Smithy cut, there's kind of a satisfying narrative structure where it's like, yeah, you get the space framing, but you still get like past, present, and future. And here, it does technically start in the past, but like only like a little amuse-bouche of like what that whole first act was supposed to be. And then it's kind of sprinkled in a little bit here and there as flashbacks in the quote-unquote present day and the future act. But it's, I don't know, the way this was structured seemed, it was actually somehow a little bit less satisfying just as a narrative structure than the Alan Smithy version for me.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. I mean, I actually do prefer the Alan Smithy version, but I did prefer the chronological narrative because, I mean, look, I've seen Bloodline a couple times, a theatrical cut, but it was really fun for me to be like, oh, if we had gotten this, and it's like, oh, you feel like the movie's gonna end when, Pinhead and Angelique get sucked back to hell, and then it's like, oh, wait, no, there's still 30 more minutes, and we're going to space.
Yeah, because remember, originally the intent was that people wouldn't even know the space stuff was coming because there would be no hint of it at all. And this workprint does give us a real good taster of, you would honestly think, okay, we were doing two different timelines, a little tiny bit in the past. That's what we're getting in this workprint. We are losing a fairly substantial amount of time in the France section. So I would say the workprint is dominated by the middle 1996 timeline, but it is interesting. Like, it reverts us back to all those conversations the two of us have had about, would people have been genuinely surprised to not know that the spaceship was coming?
I think that just makes an assumption that there was going to be people going into this who either A, hadn't seen the trailer, or they weren't going to hint that Pinhead was going to space in the trailer, which I just don't see a universe where that happens. Like, that's gotta be one of your bigger hooks to get people in the seats for this movie. Like, it's gonna be Pinhead in space. So
but they did do that with a theatrical cut and people didn't go see it.
Truly.
Well, I mean, I think that's a larger conversation about like how mainstream any of Barker's work was ever going to be. And they kind of kept trying to push this as making him like the next slasher craze, and like that was never going to happen. Like, even the biggest that it got, or like I think the closest it got to mainstream was probably the first one, and even that was still fairly niche. So yeah, the fact that they kept like stop trying to make slasher Pinhead happen, I think was the lesson from this.
I mean, really, that's what Hell on Earth is. To me, that's the most commercial effort a Hellraiser film has ever been, because we move predominantly to America. We do a bunch of nightclub action with hot young people, and Pinhead becomes his most Freddy Krueger-ish in that one. So I can't help but wonder if War was intended to be not just a kind of final chapter version of this, but yeah, something where, Trace, you said this offline, it's basically a fond farewell. Like, this is the final installment of like a contained story, which makes all the more sense when you see that Arrow has finally packaged the 4 films together, right? Like, this is Pinhead from beginning to his, I was going to say untimely end, but I guess he's lived for thousands of years at this point, because yeah, it's set, in the far off future in space.
Well, is it thousand? Oh yeah, because it's 21. The year's 21. Yeah, so it's been like a little over 1,000 years. Because didn't he die in World War One?
Yes.
Okay,
that's still not good math. For
even
us.
21. Even 21. Wow, math is not proving to be our friend. But like,
no, we're talking about a couple hundred years, not 1,000 years.
It's a little over 1,000 years.
No, it'd be 30 something if it was like, it would start with a 3 if it was over 1,000 years.
Oh, Jesus Christ, you're right. I'm sorry. But no.
It's okay. We have literally had these math conversations, I think, on both versions, both of the horror queers as well as such sites to show.
I haven't had my coffee yet, so my brain is not working. But no, I agree with what you're saying, though, because, yeah, so Arrow released that Scarlet box set, 8 years ago. And
God, is it only that? I thought it was ages ago.
No, 2016. Okay. And it only includes those first 3 movies because, and I want to say I read somewhere where they were like, well, fans hate the fourth one, so we're not going to include that. And that always kind of bummed me, because even though, like, I can see why people would think 4 is the weakest of the first 4, it does tell the complete, quote unquote, story of Pinhead from his birth to his eventual death in space. And so I feel like a lot of people who have never made it past the first 2, maybe even the first 3 films, don't realize that.
Yeah, because it feels like a derivative, schlocky sort of, oh god, this is where franchises go to die, send them to space entry.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start a little bit at the beginning. So Bryan and I have mentioned that there are fewer scenes set in France in this one. One of the other very, very notable things that folks may catch on is we're finally hearing Valentina Vargas's original voice.
What is with the compulsion to dub over Clive Barker characters? I mean, I guess it's technically not a Clive Barker character in this one, but like Clive Barker originated stories with just like middle of the road, usually American accents, because that was one of the big things I noticed. Hearing Valentina Vargas's actual voice, it's so much better. Like I liked it so much in the theatrical cut, but like it was so much better with her actual voice in this one.
She's obviously a European actress, and she's even more sexy and seductive. Like, we're very much getting that from the Angelique character. And of course, the three of us are Angelique ride or die stans. So it's one of the big complaints we've always had about this film. But she is so much more memorable and seductive in this film, just with the revert back to her original voice.
And I would say you get a little bit more from her in this one, thankfully. Like, in addition to the voice, you get at least little hints of, because I think one of our biggest complaints about the Smithy cut is that when you get to space, she is just a henchman through and through, and her storyline is completely dropped. They at least hint back to the fact that like she was the princess of hell for a long time, and she's had this like ongoing relationship with the merchant bloodline. So it's still not fully satisfying, but it's at least an effort in this one.
Yeah, there were more stretches in the middle where I was like, okay, I like watching her scheme more with the merchant character. I could have used way more scenes between her and Pinhead, but I like what you said, Bryan. Yeah, it's you're getting a taste of what the intended cut was, but we're still just... This was more similar to the theatrical cut than I was anticipating.
Yeah, because even when we read Atkins's original screenplay, we expected more of her in the future space timeline, and it's not there. It's like they just clearly do not understand how to use the Angelique character as the film progresses.
Such a
but
bummer.
You're both right. I actually prefer this cut for her characterization, because she not only gets to do a little bit more scheming, we do get a few more scenes of her with Pinhead, but I also think that when we move into the space timeline, it makes more sense about why she is in this role. And there's one meaningful exchange between her and Space Merchant, and she almost seems like her old self, right? Where she is trying to woo him. She's saying, like, we can go back because you got all these memories from the past of like your predecessors, like your ancestors and me. Don't you want to go back to that? And he rejects her, of course, because Space Merchant is boring and doesn't want to live an interesting life. But I really thought just the addition of that single scene, which is not in the Smithy cut, makes a huge difference to me understanding like just what the fuck is she doing as Pinhead's puppet in the future?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe aside from Angelique, let's talk about a few other little differences. One of the things that I liked in the France section is that we do get a glimpse of her killing the men that the Duke guy has invited over. So that's hints of the original screenplay where we were going to get the clowns murdering these men. So again, not quite as much as I had maybe hoped for, but even getting to see some of this with the Finnish VX was more than I was expecting to get from the Workprint.
Well, that's something I will say. This was much more put together than I was expecting. Like, I was expecting, like, okay, I mean, this might be like a kind of like outside baseball because we're not talking about this, but when we watch those Chucky screeners and we see like fill in VFX for rain, or like we see puppet, I was expecting that kind of stuff on this. And so while some of the CGI effects look not great.
Okay. Yeah. They're VHS level quality too.
Yeah, well, they kind of look how I would expect a 1996 CGI to look.
There was something kind of interesting for me about watching it in this format, because there was something kind of nostalgic about, like, it felt like I was watching it on a VHS tape because that's what it's based off of. So it was almost seeing this like relic, which was kind of cool. So yeah, seeing that sequence play out with the aristocrats in 18th century France, you get the hints of that. It only just kind of twisted the knife a little bit deeper for me about like what we could have seen. And I don't know if either of you got a chance to watch. Trace, you had mentioned that, you know, there are certain things where you'll see it's such a work print that there's just like a insert effects here slide or something like that. On the disc for the work print, there were additional scenes, and they did have some of those 18th century France scenes where, like, some of this stuff I don't think ever got shot. They certainly didn't do the effects for it, because there was a lot of that in these alternate scenes where it just said, this is where, because there was like an alternate Jacques death.
And it's like Jacques screaming in agony, but it's just written out on a black screen.
Yeah. So it was just like, it seemed almost intentional, where it was just like, you've bought this quadrilogy, you're very excited to see these scenes, and you get there and it's almost like that Grindhouse bit where they're getting to that lap dance with Kurt Russell and they do like the scene missing. Like it kind of felt like that, except it was just like, clearly they didn't get to these scenes. So I don't think if nothing else, Joe, I feel like this gave us closure of like, we're never going to see a Yeager cut.
We will never see anything else. This is as good as it's going to possibly ever get.
Honestly, and this will never, ever, ever happen, but I would just love for some like studio to just take the original screenplay and just make the movie with a new cast. And again, it'll never happen because who's going to go see Hellraiser 4 Bloodline now? But yeah, I'm happy y'all can get closure because of this.
It also gave me a little bit of just kind of overall closure about the fact that, you know, I think, Joe, one of the things we've talked about a lot is that part of our affection for Bloodline is that we feel like there was the possibility of a really great movie there. So it's what's both great and really frustrating about it. But I think, honestly, between seeing this and between reading the original screenplay, it also gave me closure knowing that, like, I don't think this was ever a really great movie. Like, I don't think this is something you can just write off on studio interference. This was something that was, like, I think inherently flawed from go, in terms of, like, we had numerous complaints about what they did still with Angelique, even in the original screenplay. They didn't know what to do with her. It just reiterated, like, to a certain degree, at least at this point, we know that there's not like this mythical version of this movie out there that got everything right. Like, this was always like, it was kind of a reality check where it's like, this was a mid-90s kind of cash grab movie that was there to kind of like, you know, give the quote unquote finale to this series, and wasn't ever really going to be something that reached the artistic merits of the original.
It is kind of frustrating though, because I'm sure that Joe, you and I talked about this in our Bloodline episode way back when, but it's just like, I could easily see Angelique being like a spin-off character where we're following her now. And you know what? If a gay man had written this and been like in charge of this, that might have actually happened.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they didn't understand how appealing someone like Angelique could be, where, you know, we're not ready to give you Pinhead because his part of the story hasn't begun, because technically Angelique is the Pinhead of her day. But yeah, it is kind of wild that nobody just did a quick little, you know, hey, popularity poll. What do we think of Angelique? Do we ever want to bring her back? And folks, if you are interested, you haven't been listening to such sites to show, Bryan and I spend a lot of time speculating between our discussion of the comics and back when we thought that HBO Hellraiser series was maybe going to happen. We spent a bunch of time hypothesizing about how they could bring Angelique back in a more sustained capacity still to this day.
You know what? If we get a sequel to that reboot, maybe.
I mean, at this point, I truly don't know if we will ever see another Hellraiser. I think we will, but it'll be one of those, like, we'll wait another 10 to 15 years and then somebody will say, like, I'm going to revamp this with a new remake and we'll cast all new actors all over again and try to retell the same story. And
has there been any momentum on a sequel to that reboot at all?
We haven't heard
nothing.
Anything. Not a peep. Yeah.
The fact that we got that and Prey from Hulu, and then Hulu's like, well, I guess we could give you Prey as a physical media release, but like, that's all we're interested in doing.
Yeah.
What a missed opportunity.
And it's also just a reminder of the frustration about how poorly the Hellraiser series treats its women villains. Like both Julia and Angelique, so many opportunities to explore their stories in other formats. Again, going back to, the comics revisited so many of these characters, and you never hear from Julia Cotton or Angelique ever again in any of these new iterations that have come out.
Yeah. Like, Trace, we scoured the various Hellraiser media, like comics, other like written versions of it, and those two characters don't ever come back. Like fucking Tiffany from 2 comes back in a hugely sustained way in the comics, and you're
weird.
Like, and no Julia. Really?
Really? I mean, do you think any of that has to do with Claire Higgins' refusal to come back for any of them after 2? Because I mean, she did refuse.
Maybe. I mean that makes sense for the movies, but these were the comics. Like, I would assume that they had the rights to the characters. Like, I can't think it was, and they were, doing a thing in the comics where it's not like they actually made them look like the actors or actresses that played them. Well, so I don't think it was a likeness thing.
Yeah, I don't know, Brian, because Kirsty Cotton looks exactly the same.
Does she? Oh, well, I would need to go back for whatever reason. I don't remember any of the characters going like, oh, they drew Ashley Lawrence or they drew Doug Bradley. I remember them at least being in the vicinity of like what the character would look like, but I didn't remember them looking like the actors or the actresses themselves.
Yeah. Definitely in a couple of iterations, but yeah, just for whatever reason, we've never been able to find out why. But yeah, it's like these two female villains, Angelique and Julia Cotton, they just seem to be either off the table or off everyone's radars.
That's so bizarre.
It's so bizarre. Do we want to talk at all about the 1996 timeline? Because it does feel like that's where the Workprint wants to spend most of its time and energy.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, my favorite, I guess, addition or alternate thing is during the climax of this timeline, where they're trying to do whatever his device is to shut down hell or whatever, and like a chain shoots out of Pinhead's mouth, and he like lifts himself up. Like I was
I cackled.
That's really cool.
It looks great. I can't believe they got rid of it.
And I just love the idea of him kind of just hanging up there like a cornered cat or something like that. And just kind of like looking down with this scowl as everything kind of goes to shit. I think it's the Elysium configuration, if I remember correctly.
That is the name. And then you have Angelique like holding the little boy like, no, why isn't it working? It's like, well, because he chained himself up to the ceiling, bitch.
Well, I also like that Merchant in this timeline he's actually struggling to make this work. It does sort of build up anticipation of him finally getting it right for the space timeline. Whereas here, it's basically like, oops, I got decapitated before I could really do anything.
Ooh, his decapitation also looks better in the Workprint.
Yeah, some of the special effects, like I know we said some of them look pretty dodgy and some of them are very like, oh, I did this on my, my Linux 96 or whatever back in the day. But it does feel like they touched up some of the gore so that you do get it. Like we get a more impressive extended sequence of the twins being conjoined, and I was like,
yeah,
this looks good.
I think even Jacques' death has, I mean, it's not like an extended scene, but I think there's a few more shots of her fingers going into his face.
Yes.
Yeah. She holds that, like, when she bites it, and then she kind of like fingers the wound a little bit. Yeah, they hold on to that a while longer in the Workprint.
Which is good, because this movie was kind of hurting for sex, right? Like, there's a little bit with her and Merchant in the 96 timeline, but there's more with Meryl Streep's like suggestions of she knows that her husband is cheating on her with this really hot exotic lady.
Yeah. I mean, she like that. Those characters still feel very superfluous. Like, I don't know why we need a kid in this movie, but whatever.
Right. Yeah. Just to establish that the bloodline will continue.
Right. Yeah.
I thought another little fun, I guess not addition, but thing that was left in that didn't make the Smithy cut was in the little precursor scene, the little tete-a-tete between Pinhead and Angelique before the twin sequence, where he does that thing where he kind of like hooks into her sternum. They definitely draw that a little bit more, and obviously, you know, they're going for some vaginal imagery when he's kind of like fingering the wound a little bit. That was like the little squelching sounds and stuff like that. That was I kind of wish that had made the final cut.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because a lot of this just feels like, oh, we took some of this out for pacing, or because we wanted to get to the space stuff a little bit faster and so on. But even though so much of this is similar, or it's just like a couple of extra beats or something, some of this really does feel like, ooh, you could put that back in the Smithy cut, and I do think it would improve the film. Like, as you said, Brian, it's not going to save a movie if people already don't like this film, but I do think that it just makes it a little bit sharper, a little bit more interesting, a little sexier. So let's talk a little bit about the space stuff, because we do get a completely different ending, and also we have way fewer of these dumb as fuck Jason X soldiers.
Rimmer is really someone that I wish had more to do in this finale. But I mean, I guess that's the issue though with telling this chronologically, is that we're introducing so many new characters at the hour mark of this 80-minute movie.
Yup.
Also, can we just point out how this iteration of Merchant is so good with a knife that he is able to give himself a buzz cut and still leave like a perfectly manicured little bit of hair on his head, again with a knife. That was some good work, because they do give a little bit more of, you know, you kind of see him grappling with his mental health a little bit, and they've decided to show that with he's got like this long straggly hair that he decides to shave off with this knife.
Yes.
I will say I did appreciate though this version of Merchant kind of really struggling like with the literal generational trauma of being part of the Lemershon like bloodline. Like, he is worried about what he's become. No, not at all. You know, and you know, you see that conflict where he's like, have I become this monster that I'm fighting against through my obsession? So I did think that was an interesting element that I do think, you know, there's still hints of that in the Smithy version, but they definitely explore that more here, and particularly in the final showdown with him and Pinhead.
Yeah, I appreciated the inclusion of something like a virtual reality therapist, because that felt very where we thought the future was going to go. I do think you're right, Trace. This hurts Rimmer, because even the inclusion of that doctor character is reduced screen time for Rimmer, because normally John would be confiding in her.
Yeah.
But I kind of liked that, especially if we're going to end with this character dying by suicide to finally take Pinhead out, it makes more sense to say, okay, he is going through some shit. Like, he is having to decide whether or not martyring himself so that he can finally end this generational conflict is worthwhile. Whereas in the Alan Smithy cut, he's quite a bit more like boastful, confident white man.
Which honestly, there was something I appreciated about that approach. Like, I'm actually not mad about the Space Merchant that wound up in the Smithy cut. I like that he's a little bit bent, but he's also like, I also like the idea that he was like, I'm crazy, but I'm not that crazy in terms of like he's not suicidal in that version.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think this one is probably a little bit more like true to the arc that they're trying to give the character. But I did think it was fun that in the Smithy version, he's just like, he's a little bent, but he's still like got his like wits about him. Here, not quite so much.
He's just a bit of a loose cannon.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you're thinking in terms of like a studio executive or a marketing assistant or something, this is a harder merchant to sell. Whereas if you give us a kind of space hero guy who's going to save the day and maybe get the girl, that's probably an easier story to sell to the masses.
I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I'm also just like, it's Hellraiser. It's already difficult to sell to the masses.
Truly. Yeah. Every point counts.
Stop trying to make mainstream Hellraiser happen. It's just not going
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. I mean, I think the thing that I like a little less about the Workprint in the space sequence, like I actually didn't mind a lot of this. I thought it was maybe a little bit better, but it's really just because I don't like the janky army stuff.
Yeah.
We do not get the amazing Doug Bradley performance as Pinhead realizes that he has been foiled and he has those classic Pinhead lines. Like we don't get that here because we just go boom.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering to what degree that's because that was the Workprint. Because I do think that if they had played that showdown, I like narratively this new showdown between Merchant and Pinhead, where the chains get involved. He actually like chains through Merchant. Merchant pulls himself towards Pinhead. And I think where they lose it is, then it's just like kablim.
Boom. Well, because it's about Merchant. It's not about Pinhead.
Truly.
But I feel like if that version had made it to the final cut, I think they probably would have put more money into kind of incorporating the grand exit that Pinhead gets with that. Like I just honestly think that at that point they just hadn't really put the final like flourishes and touches on that. And it was disappointing to see, but like I had to remember it within the context of like this wasn't done yet. So I think it would have been pretty gnarly to see that play out where, you know, you get the whole thing with Merchant like pulling himself up by the chain and then kind of transitioning more into like Pinhead getting blown into like that's one of my favorite sequences from the Smithy cut is him getting like blown back into the wall and his face is just like bleeding out and he just gets that quick like amen and just kabloom. Like I think that combining those two things would have been really satisfying.
Right. Yeah, one of the scenes in the deleted scenes or the not quite finished bits is Merchant is actually facing down against a variety of the chains, but it almost looks like a pre-Matrix moment, and I couldn't figure out if it was just that it was missing the FX or if it was suggesting that Merchant had some kind of ability to control, like he actually was Pinhead's foil. He had some of the same capacities in this future timeline. And that really got my head spinning about, were we going to try to do something a little bit different with this character after all?
I think the answer is actually the former, but I like your optimism.
Probably. He's a messiah figure. He really is a chosen one, though. He's the only person after, hundreds of years that can finally take down Pinhead, so...
Well, I did notice, though, you do catch a very quick glimpse, even in the full Workprint version, you do get that very quick shot of Merchant standing there with like 4 chains like poised at him. Like, because I think it's actually in the scene where he reveals that those 4 chains are pointed at his hologram. And so, I caught that too in terms of like, there was a lot more of a showdown in terms of like the chains were so much more involved with this and how it played out.
Which is so funny because in all of the sequels to this, it's like the number one thing that we do is just like use those chains to kill people. And it becomes really tired and really boring after about like 5 or 6. So it's kind of fascinating that 4 was going to have more of them, but it seems like we pulled it back a little.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we wrap this up by not just inviting listeners who have had the opportunity to check the Workprint out to reach out, but also, gentlemen, I would like to hear your rating. Do you prefer the theatrical cut, aka the Alan Smithy version, or do you prefer this Workprint, or do you want to be boring and say some version of the two?
I do prefer the theatrical, if only because I do think it's a bit more cohesive, which is kind of weird to say, but there are elements of the Workprint that I would like to have seen made their way over to the theatrical cut. I think there's a really, I don't want to say really good, but like a slightly better than both versions, like 95-minute movie in here somewhere.
Yes. Yeah. The elusive Yeager cut, the director's cut, right?
Well, it was a weird thing, though, where I was like, oh, wow, this Workprint's only 82 minutes. Like, I feel like that's so much shorter than the theatrical cut, not realizing that the credits roll at the 80-minute mark on the theatrical cut.
Okay. I'm Bryan.
I think ultimately I land on preferring the Smithy cut.
Okay.
Honestly, it comes down to my need for like narrative symmetry and the fact that the Smithy cut has the past, the present, and the future is just it for some reason. And this might just be back to that conversation we've had so many times at this point, Joe, where it's like kind of the similar thing as reading the book and then seeing the movie. You know, this is not reading the book, but seeing like the original version of what I came to expect, and then kind of seeing that thrown off, and in a way where like whatever they were doing wasn't done yet. Yeah, it just felt incomplete to me because it kind of was incomplete because it was a Workprint. But yeah, it was just, I think the narrative structure is just still more satisfying to me in the Smithy cut.
Yeah, this Workprint cut is working overtime to incorporate dreams. Like Merchant has recurring nightmares that are used as transition devices to occasionally bring us back to France and then also to bring us back to 1996. And I think in some cases it works, but yeah, I do like having big chunks of time dedicated to a single timeline because then you actually get to feel like you're there, right? Like I often felt a tension between, okay, do I need to focus on the past compared to the 96 version? Like, in some ways, it flowed more smoothly, but I don't know that it always made the narrative that much more satisfying, if that makes sense.
I think it does.
But I would definitely take these additional Angelique scenes and put them into the Smithy cut. And then I still want the fucking clowns from the screenplay because I need to see that realized visually. Still waiting.
Well, so basically you said, are you going to take the boring approach and try and combine them?
Yes,
Trace and I did not do that, and then you come on in and sweep that up. I see your approach.
You know what needs to happen? We just need to remake the first 4 movies in the franchise and just do it, and then we'll just use the original script for this, but fix it. But we'll just get more like 1-to-1 remakes of 1 and 2. I don't know. 3 could stay the same for all I give a shit. But let's
so really, we're just remaking 4.
Yeah, but we're gonna have a studio give millions and millions of dollars for 4 movies just so we can get the 4th one.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll do a bait and switch. Yeah. We won't actually. We'll take all the money that we were going to get to do a quadrilogy. We'll leave all the first 3 exactly the same and just make a huge budget Pinhead in space and just sink all of our money into that. I think there's really no way we can lose on that.
Yeah. Take it to the bank. All right. Well, Mr. Bryan, if people want to talk to you about the Hellraiser Bloodline Workprint, how would they get in touch?
Either through Instagram or Blue Sky at Evil Taylor Hicks.
Okay. And Trace, if people want to clap back at you that no, the Workprint is obviously easier to understand, how would they reach out?
Yeah, you can reach me at Trace D as in dog Thurman on anywhere. Facebook, Twitter, X, Instagram, whatever the fuck. Or, on all of our horror queer stuff.
There we go. Yeah. And I can be reached at B Stole My Remote, and that's the letter B. And folks, if you are listening to this on the Horror Queers feed and you are interested, you can seek out Such Sights to Show. It is on the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad network, and we have episodes dedicated to pretty much everything Clive Barker has done except for his longer novels, because we're tired. But yeah, actually the next episode that we're talking about will be a consideration of Books of Blood Volume 5. So if you're interested in reading some short stories, maybe rewatching Candyman, which Trace, you and I have already covered on the Horror Queers main feed, that's where we're going to be headed next.
Oh.
Yeah. Until then, we can... I don't know, Trace, do you want to help me out here?
Oh, we can cross out the Hellraiser Bloodline Workprint.
There we go. And we can cross out this crossover of Such Sights to Show and Horror Queers.
Scream Pod Squad.
Atlas Avenue. A long stretch of road that encompasses everything the city of Kennett Heights has to offer. Neon lights, traffic, crime, the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and the craziest of characters. My office was above it all. My name is James Locke, and I'm a PI.
Hello, Mr. J. How the hell you doing today?
Good, Edith. Nearly every year I have a new case. New people to meet, new clues to discover, and new problems to solve. But I do it the old-fashioned way. No technology. Nothing post-1950. Hell, I don't even listen to podcasts, but you should. Atlas Avenue Beat is a spoof of the film noir genre with goofy characters, tons of wordplay, and non-stop raunchy humor. There's also 3 whole seasons out right now with more on the way. Just search for Atlas Avenue Beat wherever you listen to podcasts or visit us online at bloody.fm.